Good morning, my ECO 3311 students. Today is June 12th. Yesterday we completed chapter 8, which is a chapter on the financial structure. And the video recordings for that chapter is at Canvas. I'm going to be recording the lecture on chapter 9 today, which is a chapter on the management of financial institutions. So this is a very important chapter we're going to be using. It teaches you about if you ever become a chief executive of a bank or a financial institution, what do you need to do on a day-to-day basis to be able to profit maximize? So we're going to talk about the general principles of bank management, which is very exciting. And in a lot of ways, you're going to learn that managing a financial institution like a bank requires knowledge of the components of the balance sheet. So you're going to be managing assets on the balance sheet of a bank, liabilities, managing credit risk, because banks give loans. So credit risk is always something that you need to manage carefully. We're going to talk about interest rate risk. We're going to manage, capital adequacy management. So there are a variety of things that you do on a day-to-day basis to make sure that your bank stays profitable. So I'm going to share my screen right now on that chapter, then we'll talk about it in full detail. So there is your chapter 9, which is banking and the management of financial institutions. Okay. So here we're going to talk about the preview. The chapter is going to examine how banks attempt to maximize profit. And then although the discussion that follows focuses primarily on commercial banks, many of the same principles will apply to other financial intermediaries as well. Like if you ever start a hedge funds, for example, or mutual fund or pension fund, it's going to be the same logic. If you're the head of a hedge fund, how do you profit maximize? What are the general principles that you put in place to be able to make your bank stay profitable or your financial institution? Okay. So here's going to be the learning objectives. So we are going to summarize the features of a bank balance sheet. Because as I said, managing a financial institution like a bank as a CEO, you're going to be managing components of the balance sheet. So we need to know what the balance sheet of a bank look like, what are the assets of the bank, and what are the liabilities of the bank. Many of you know what a balance sheet is. You've taken this for sure if you're in the business school. It's a double accounting entry where transaction enters a debit and as a credit. So the balance sheet must always balance. You know that. So we shall also apply changes to a bank assets and liabilities on the T account. So we're just going to using a T account as a representation of a balance sheet. Identify ways in which banks can manage their assets and liabilities to maximize profits. We're going to list the ways in which banks deal with credit risk and apply what we call the gap and duration analysis and identify interest rate risk. And then we shall also talk about some off-balance sheet activities. There are things that as a bank CEO, you're going to be doing on a day-to-day basis, which may not be directly tied to the balance sheet, but that can help your bank be more efficient. So those activities that are not directly connected to the balance sheet, we're going to call them off-balance sheet activities. For example, ensuring that your employees are not mismanaging the company's assets, making sure that maybe charging a fee income, ensuring that the workers are coming to work on time and they're working, doing work to the best of their abilities. So those are some of the off-balance sheet activities that as a manager, you got to make sure that you tighten up for your bank to stay profitable. So the balance sheet of the bank, we're going to start with the liability side because a balance sheet is a double accounting entry, as I said, where transaction enters a debit and as a credit. So on the right-hand side of the balance sheet, we always record liabilities of a bank, including capital. Okay, and then on the left-hand side of a T account, we're going to record the assets. But let's begin by discussing what are the liabilities of a bank. So the first one is going to be what we call checkable deposit. When you go deposit money in your bank, let's say at Bank of America, let's say you deposit $1,000 this morning. That is not Bank of America's money. That is your money. So all checkable deposits that are put in a bank, the bank is going to record those as liability. It is as if the bank is borrowing money from you. And I want you to think about this. So anytime you deposit money in a bank, it is as if the bank is borrowing money from you. So that's a liability to the bank. So all checkable deposits are recorded on the liability side of the bank balance sheet. And then all non-transaction deposits. When I say non-transaction deposit, it's going to be any deposit made in a bank, which is not a checkable deposit. So this could include things like savings account, which we talked about. Anything put in savings account. It could be things like maybe mutual funds, mutual fund deposits, certificate of deposit, etc. Okay, anything which is not a checking account, which is deposited in a bank, we call them non-transaction deposits. And then banks also borrow money. Okay, Bank of America can borrow money from other banks. That's allowed. Bank borrow from among each other. Citibank can borrow from Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo can borrow from Bank of America. Bank of America can borrow from Capital One. So they can borrow from among each other. Banks can also borrow from corporations. And they can also borrow from the Federal Reserve. We're going to talk about the Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States that regulate all banks. But the Fed also gives loans to banks as a last resort. If Bank of America were in liquidity, did not have enough liquidity, doesn't mean Bank of America is broke. They just need, maybe most of their investments are tied up in what? In long-term assets, which cannot easily be liquidated, but they may need cash. Bank of America can go to other banks and try to borrow. If other banks don't have funds to give Bank of America and they have tried everywhere, then the last place Bank of America is going to borrow money is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a banker's bank. It loans money to financial institutions. And then the last main item that is recorded on the liability side of the bank balance sheet is going to be bank capital, or you can call it owner's equity. That's the liability of a bank. Why? So in any normal balance sheet, capital is always recorded on the liability side. Why? Think about even yourself. If you take $1 million of your dollars, your money, your savings, and you start your small business, you use that as capital to start in your own business, it is as if you have loaned money to your business. So that would be a liability to your business, because in business terms, even if you own a business, there has to be a separation between the business itself and yourself. You cannot entangle yourself, even though you own that business. Okay. So if you loan money, if you pick $1 million from your savings account and you use it as capital to start a small business, it is as if you have loaned money to your business. So that is, your business is going to record that as a liability, even though that's your money and that's your business. That's the way it is. So when people put money to start a bank, put capital, bank owners start a bank, that bank capital it is as if they have loaned money to their business, to the bank. So it's going to be recorded as a liability. So those are the four main items that go on the liability side. So let's talk about the asset side. Okay. So assets are going to be the first item that we're going to be talking a lot of is going to be what we call reserves. What are reserves? Reserves are going to be defined as bank deposit with the Federal Reserve and vol cash. So let me explain it. First of all, vol cash, this is cash that the bank keep at its facility. Every bank will have a ton of money that they keep within the bank facility, so that when you go to withdraw your money, the bank should be ready to pay you money. If you want to withdraw maybe $50,000 or $10,000, $1,000, the bank cannot tell you that, oh, wait a second, we don't have money. So they're going to have cash within the bank facility for running the bank for daily activities like caring for customers' withdrawals, or maybe money that they need to run the day-to-day activities of the bank. So any money that the bank keeps within the bank is what we call vol cash. And then, as I told you, the Federal Reserve is the banker's bank. Me and you and corporations do not open account with the Federal Reserve, with the U.S. Central Bank, but banks do. Just like me and you can open money with commercial banks, private banks like Bank of America. Bank of America can open an account with a central bank where they deposit their money, just like me depositing money in Bank of America. But you and me and corporation are not allowed to open an account with what? The Fed, Federal Reserve. So any deposit that banks have with the Federal Reserve is what we call reserves. Okay? Any bank deposit with the Fed are called reserves, plus vol cash. And then the second item that goes on the asset side of the bank balance sheet is the cash items in the process of collection. What do we mean by that? Or sometimes you got people where you guys are taking accounting, we call those accounts receivable. Another way you can call them accounts receivable. Okay. So if I write a check, if you write a check and you deposit it in a Bank of America, or let's say you owe me $500, and then you write me a check of $500 to pay off that debt, I'm going to deposit that check into my account, like say with Bank of America. But remember, check is not cash yet. It takes about 3 to 5 business days for every check that is written again as a bank to clear. So during the time when the check is going through the check clearing process, Bank of America is going to record that item on the asset side as what? Cash items in the process of collection. Okay. So that's going to be, it's going to be an asset, you know what I mean? Cash items in the process of collection because, okay. And then, so then we're going to have the third item is going to be deposits at other banks. Bank of America, Citibank, Wells Fargo, they can also open an account with other banks. Bank of America can have an account with Citibank or with Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo can do the same thing and have an account with Bank of America where they deposit some of their money. So anytime Bank of America deposits some of its money with Wells Fargo, that is Bank of America's assets. Its deposit with other banks is its assets. And then the next thing that item, which we're going to be recording as an asset, is securities. Banks, especially commercial banks, are allowed to invest in the bond market. They are not allowed by federal law to invest in the stock market. When it is securities, and we're talking about regular commercial banks, we basically tie to bonds. But investment banks can invest in both bonds and stocks, like mutual funds, pension funds, hedge funds. They can invest in both stocks and bonds. But regular commercial banks can only buy bonds, like treasury bonds or municipal bonds and stuff like that. Okay. So when a bank invests in bonds, those are its assets. Okay. So securities or bond investment by banks, are going to be their assets. And then the other one of the key component elements of the bank balance sheet, one of the largest component of the bank assets is actually loans. Banks give different types of loans. Okay. The loans they give here can range from commercial loans. Okay. They can give consumer loans like credit cards. They can give what we call mortgage loans. They can give student loans. Okay. They can give farm mortgages. So there are different types of loans that banks can give out, ranging from commercial or business loans to consumer loans, mortgage loans, student loans, farm mortgages, etc. Okay. So loans are the biggest component of the bank assets. I'm going to soon share with you on the balance sheet. And then, of course, we're going to talk about other assets. Other assets could include banks, like the bank buildings, and other assets that the bank own out there. I mean, bank might own some land, some gold, whatever. So we're just going to lump this and call them other assets. So I want to share with you what a typical balance sheet of a bank look like. This is going to be like a summary for all U.S. commercial banks. Okay. So let's talk about it. So this is a summary of a balance sheet for all commercial banks in America as a percentage of the items, as a percentage of the total as of June 2020, like during COVID. Okay. So let's start with the liability side of the balance sheet. So liability, if we say checkable deposit, is a liability to a bank. When you deposit money in your bank account, those are what? Liabilities. So that accounts for 14% of total liabilities of the bank. Okay. And then saving deposit in all commercial banks in America, which is saving. So we talk about non-transaction deposit. That includes saving deposit and a small denomination time deposit account. So saving deposit is a big chunk too. It counts for 52% of total bank liability. That is as of June 2020. These numbers may fluctuate over time. And then the small denomination time deposit. These are CDs or certificate of deposit. We call them small. Anything that is under $100,000 in value is called a small denomination time deposit account. Large denomination time deposit account is anything above $100,000 in value. Is a large, so that account for about 9%, but small denomination about 2%. And then borrowings, banks can borrow from a Federal Reserve, or they can borrow from among each other. They could also borrow from corporations. So that's about 10% of total liabilities. And then the bank capital, the money that the owners of the bank are put in place to run the bank in the first place. So that's about 13%. Okay. So if you add all the liability side, because this must add to 100%. Okay. You add all of them together, what do you get? You're adding basically 14% to 52%. That's going to give you 66%, 68%. That's going to be 77%. 77%, that's going to be 87%, and then 100%, because they must start to 100. This is just giving you the share of each of the components of the balance sheet as a percentage of the total. Then on the asset side, okay, you can see we have reserves and cash items. Let's go to reserve. When I say reserves, I basically mean bank deposit with the Fed, and cash items, or what we are calling vol cash. We put them, we lump these two together. Vol cash basically is the money within the bank facility that the bank keeps to run the bank on a day-to-day basis. So reserves and cash items are 15% of the what? 15% of the total bank assets. And then securities, bank invests in different securities. Mostly they invest in U.S. government and agency securities. Banks also invest in state and local government and other securities, like municipal bonds. So U.S. Treasury bonds account for 16% of total bank assets. And state and local government and other securities account for about 4% of the total bank assets. Let's continue. So then loans, I said loans are the biggest component of the bank balance sheet. So these are the different types of loans or components of loan that banks were giving out. Commercial and industrial loans account for 14%. Real estate loan or mortgage loans, about 23% of total assets. Consumer loans like credit cards account for 7%. And then other loans account for 8%. So if you add all the loan components, 14 plus 23, that is going to be 37. 37 plus 7, that is going to be 44. 44 plus 5, that is like 52%. So that's a large. So 50% of the total bank assets constitute loans, the different loans that they give. And then other assets, which may include physical capital, okay, account with 13%. So when you add everything, the left-hand side or the asset side of the bank balance sheet, from reserves and cash items to securities, and then to different types of loans, they go and add up to 100%. So that's kind of a snapshot of how the T account or the balance sheet of banks, all banks in the United States look like as of June 2020. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing next, I'm going to be doing some kind of balance sheet entries, because this is very important. The first thing we're going to start with is for you to understand, before we even start talking about how the chief executive of a bank manages components of this balance sheet, like assets, liabilities, credit risk on the balance sheet, those kind of stuff. We need to first understand balance sheet entries. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say, suppose somebody went and deposited money or opened a new account with some bank called First National Bank. Okay, they open an account. Okay, so immediately, okay, so these are two balance sheets that are doing one, but I want to show you how the balance sheet is going to change. So from here, this is one balance sheet. Okay, I just joined them together. the other section. Okay, but still, so immediately, let's say you open an account with cash, okay, $100 cash. Because a balance sheet is a double accounting entry, transaction is going to end as a debit and as a credit. So first of all, the bank already has so much deposit available. If you go and deposit $100 in your bank this morning, that doesn't mean that's the only deposit in that bank. That bank already has like trillions or billions of other people's deposit or other deposit from elsewhere. Your deposit is just gonna add on to what already exists. That's why we're saying when you deposit money, checkable deposit is a what? It's a liability to the bank. So you go and what? Give a bank or you deposit $100 cash. Let's say this morning a bank of First National Bank. The bank is gonna record that their liabilities are gonna go up what? $100. But now the bank will now have cash, which is $100, because a balance sheet is a double accounting entry. If you give a bank $100 cash to open a checking account, or you deposit money in your checking account, checkable deposit is going to go up $100, and then the left-hand side, the assets of the bank are also going to go up $100, because the bank now has $100 of your money in cash, vol cash available to the bank. That's the asset. So that's how we do the double accounting entry. So if this balance sheet was balancing where the asset side was equal to the right-hand side, it should still balance. Because on the right-hand side, we added something worth $100, and on the left-hand side, we have added something worth $100. So it should still balance. So we know that I told you that vol cash are part of reserves, because reserves are bank deposited with the Fed, including the vol cash. Or the bank could actually deposit this vol cash money that you gave them into their account with the Federal Reserve. With a bank deposit with the Federal Reserve is called reserves. With the Fed is called what? Reserves. So then now this vol cash is going to be translated into what we call what? Which is going to call it reserves, which is going to go up what? $100. Checkable deposit still $100. So that's how the balance is going to change. Like this guy just transform itself into what? Reserves, because it's part of reserve. So what have we learned so far? When you open a checkable deposit account, or you deposit money in an existing checking account deposit, it's going to lead to an increase in the bank reserves equal to the increase in checkable deposit. So in other words, if you deposit a check of, cash of $100, the assets of the bank, which is called reserves, will increase, and liabilities of the bank, which we're calling what? Checkable deposit, will also what? Increase. So both checkable deposit, which is a liability of the bank, and reserves, which is an asset of the bank, are all going to increase by the same amount of the deposit. Okay, so let's talk a little bit of a different scenario. What about if you wrote a check instead? If you go and open an account by writing a check of $100, instead of giving the bank $100 cash, you wrote a check and deposited it into that First National Bank. So immediately you deposit that check into that bank. The balance sheet is a double accounting entry. The bank is going to record that there's a liability of $100 because you deposited a check. That is your money, not the bank's money. Okay? But what is going to happen is that a check is not cash yet. On the asset side, the bank is going to record that as cash items in the process of collection. Because a physical check, because some people write checks and they don't have money in their account. There's so many checks that get bounced out there. Remember, it's illegal to write a check if you don't have money in your account. But, there's so many checks that bounce out there. So we need to wait for a couple of days for that check to clear, to turn into cash. Okay? So but if you deposit check anyway, this is how we're going to record it immediately on the balance sheet of the bank. So the liability is going to increase by $100, and then cash items, which is a check you deposit, is going to be recorded as $100. Double account entry. Now, once this check clears, okay, once the check clears, First National Bank its reserve is going to increase by $100. Checkable deposit still $100, because this thing has already cleared. Okay. And then think about it for a second. Let's say you're the person who wrote a check. You wrote a check to open up another account or with First National Bank. But your existing account is already with Second National Bank. So the Second National Bank, because that's a bank that we're going to draw down $100, they're going to see their checkable deposit go down by $100. It's like saying you have an account already with Second National Bank, and then you write a check of $100 to open another account with another bank called First National Bank. So that means your account with Second National Bank, where you've written a check against, is going to be drawn down. So your checkable deposit is going to go down with your current bank, which is Second National Bank. And then, but your account with a new bank is going to be credited with $100. So that's why you're seeing negative $100 here, negative $100 here, because this is a bank where we're going to be drawing down that check against the check you've written. The withdrawal is going to happen in this bank. Meanwhile, deposit is going to happen in this bank. So anytime you write a check, and the way it happens, I wanna be very clear here. I said at the beginning that all banks have an account with the Federal Reserve called the reserve account. So all checks that are written in America go through the Federal Reserve system for clearance, because all banks already have an account with the check with the Fed. So what is going to happen is that if I write a check, and that check is going to be drawn against my what? Second National Bank to open a new account with First National Bank. This check is going to go to the Federal Reserve because the Federal Reserve has got the accounts of both banks. Then the Fed is going to debit the reserve account, the bank, the Second National Reserve's account with the Fed. These are deposit of Second National Bank with the Fed. It's going to be they're going to draw down the account by $100. The bank that this check is written against. But then the Fed is going to credit the bank where that check is should be deposited, which is First National Bank, by the same amount of the money, $100. And as the process is complete. Let me repeat that again. All banks in America have an account with the Federal Reserve called the reserve account. So when you write a check of $100, which has to be drawn against your bank with which is Second National Bank, to open a new account with First National Bank, that check has to go through the Federal Reserve system for clearance. And since all banks have an account with the Fed called a reserve account, one bank's account with the Fed is going to be debited, and the other bank where the check is has to be deposited has to be credited. So this bank is where the check is written against is going to see its reserves go down by $100. Its deposit with the Fed is going to go down $100. And the bank where the check is going will see its what? Reserve or its deposit with the Fed going up $100. And the process is complete. But because you wrote a check, a balance sheet is a double accounting entry, remember. See, the checkable, that means your checkable deposit is going to be drawn down too. Checkable deposit are what? Bank liability. So Second National Bank is going to see its liability, checkable deposit draw down $100, but its reserve also going to go down $100. That's the way it is. So I can summarize something here because for you to see what I'm talking about here. So the whole thing that I talked about here thus far, let me summarize it here. Let me open a new slide here and we'll talk about it. Okay. So what I'm writing here is that a deposit in a bank, made in a bank, if you deposit money in a bank, whether you deposit a check or you deposit cash, will increase the bank asset which we're calling what? Bank, that specific asset we are talking about is reserves, the reserves of the bank, and liability, which we are calling what? Deposit, or checkable, you can call it checkable deposit, by the same amount. That's point number one. A deposit, if you deposit $100 check or cash, that eventually is going to increase the asset of the bank. The asset of the bank is called reserves in that case, and also going to increase the liability of the bank. That means the deposit has been made in a bank deposit going to go up. Checkable deposit is a bank liability. but reserves are bank assets because a double accounting entry where a transaction ends as a debit and as a credit. So what we have just learned is that what about if you write a check or you withdraw money from a bank? So a withdrawal, another way of talking about if you withdraw money from your bank, we also call that deposit outflow. That's another way of saying withdrawal. So deposit outflow. So a withdrawal, also known as deposit outflow, will decrease bank assets, which we are calling what? Reserves, and decrease bank liability, which we are calling checkable deposit, by the same amount. So it goes either way, same amount. So if you withdraw $1,000 from your bank, the bank liabilities, checkable deposit is going to go down $1,000. Checkable deposits are bank liabilities. But then the reserves, the bank pay out that withdrawal by using money which they have within the facility called vol cash, which is part of its reserve, to pay for that withdrawal. So banks are going to see their reserves, which is their assets, going down by $1,000 as well. That's what it is. All right. So now let's talk about, when you ask me, why were banks created in the first place? Banks do. So here's how banks operate to make money. When you read, this was perhaps one of the most fascinating readings, the evolution of banking, because when you go back to primitive times, there were no banks. So the first banks that were created out there, when the banks were first created, they were used for just to keep the customer money safe. People would just deposit their money in the bank, and the bank would keep the money safe and charge them a small fee for keeping their money safe. But banks started to think about an idea that so the idea is that we're going to have people who we're going to have a bank. Okay. The bank connects between two types of people. So we're going to have depositors. Depositors, you can call them savers. They're going to deposit money into their bank, whether in checking account or savings account. So this is a bank. So this is going to be deposit that we talked about. So as I said, when the first banks were created back in the days, in ancient times, we didn't have banks. Their job was basically just people with extra money would deposit money in the bank, and the bank would keep their money safe and would charge them a small fee for doing that. Because the idea was that if you had $1 million back in the days when the first banks were first created, you fear that somebody may rob you, may break into your house and rob all your $1 million. So to keep that $1 million safe, you're going to deposit in a bank. The bank is going to keep it safe for you, and they will pay you. They will charge you a small fee for keeping your money safe. That's what banks did at the very beginning. But then banks had to become wise, say that, well, if people are depositing, and by the way, you can not only deposit cash in a bank. Some people think that when the banks are only there where you deposit money. Banks can you can deposit precious metals like gold in a bank. Yes, you can deposit gold into your bank account, and they will keep your gold safe for you. Precious metals like gold. And the bank would charge you a small fee for keeping your. If you feel like somebody's going to rob your house and steal your gold bars, you put that in the bank, and the bank keeps it safe for you. But as I said, banks started to be wise. They're going to say, okay, if we are getting tons and tons of money from customers who want us to keep their money, we can start making money doing this. So when customers deposit their money in the bank, we are going to use those funds and give out loans. So these people on the other side are borrowers. Because at every point in time in an economy, like the United States, there are people who are saving money, depositing money in the bank. Then there are people who don't have money to spend. But so those people who don't have money to spend, they go and borrow. So when the bank started to do this, that's why we call it financial intermediary. A bank is a financial intermediary. Why do we call it a financial intermediary? It's because the bank plays an intermediation role. It intermediates between depositors and borrowers in the economy. It's a go-between the two types of individuals. Okay? And these deposits are not only ordinary Americans or American families depositing money. It can be government, it can be corporations, all different types of deposit can come from companies, from ordinary people, from government. Okay, so now the question is, how does the bank make money by doing this, by playing this intermediation role? So now, once the bank started to give out loans, the bank are going to say, well, now, once you deposit money in the bank, we're no longer, in fact, we're actually going to give you what? We're going to pay you what we call a saving interest rate. Okay? And once we loan those funds you've given us to borrowers, we're gonna charge them what we call the lending interest rate. And so how does a bank make money? The bank make money when what? What we call the bank profit from loanable funds. You can say bank started making money, bank profit from loanable funds, when they loan funds. And where those funds come from? They come from customer deposit. So the bank profit from loanable funds is also what we call interest rate spread. That is the difference between lending interest rate minus saving interest rate. So what modern banks do, when you go and deposit money into your bank account, like savings account, the bank may agree that they're going to pay you a saving interest rate of 4% on your money that you put in the bank. But then they're going to turn around and lend those funds to somebody else and charge a 7% interest rate. The lending interest rate is always above the saving interest rate. So the difference in the lending interest rate and the saving interest rate is the bank profit from loaning those funds you have given them to other people, which would be the bank would be making 3% on the money you gave them. That's how banks operate. Okay. All right. So now that you understood that, let's start to see now, because we have talked about how we would once you deposit money in the bank, how the bank would enter that in the balance sheet. Eventually, the banks are going to transform some of those money into loans. Okay. So, but before I talk about that, I want to make sure everybody understands so now there are regulatory requirements. Regulation. So the government, through the Federal Reserve, then came up with a regulatory requirement that if a bank is engaged in accepting customers' deposit and then use those deposits and lend out to other people in the economy and making profit, banks could become reckless. Okay? Let's say some guy called Tom goes and deposits $1 million in Bank of America today, or First National Bank. And then First National Bank decides to loan all the $1 million to some lady called Sarah. Okay, so but what about if the person who deposits the money comes back tomorrow wanting to withdraw some of that money, and the bank has already loaned all of it? That would put the banks in jeopardy, because the bank will not have enough money to loan out. So the Federal Reserve then came up with an idea that, okay, we're going to have what we call a minimum reserve requirement. Or you can just call it reserve requirement. So we're going to say the minimum reserve requirement is a fraction or, I want to make sure that I use the same notation because, sometimes we Just hold on a second. I want to make sure that the notation I'm using here is the same. That's okay. I think I didn't have it here anyway. So anyway, a minimum reserve required. The fraction R, which is in percentage, is a fraction R of deposits must not be loaned out by the bank. So we're going to say the reserve requirement, we're going to call it RR. So the reserve requirement, or the minimum reserve requirement, we are taking reserve requirement ratio, which is R. It's a fraction, means it's a ratio. It's a percentage multiplied by deposit D. So D stands for deposit. The RR, this is a reserve requirement. It's by law. So let me do an example here. So let's say, and that money must be deposited with the Fed. That minimum reserve requirement must be deposited with the Fed. So the Federal Reserve is not gonna be picking and look at what each customer is depositing, whether the bank is keeping up with the minimum reserve requirement. But every 2 weeks, because the banks already have an account with the Fed is just gonna look at what was the total deposit made in First National Bank within the 2 weeks window. And then it shows up on the balance sheet that $10 billion were deposited at the First National Bank. And then by law, the Fed might say 10% of those total deposits should be kept as minimum reserve requirement with the Federal Reserve. So what is 10% of $10 billion? That would be $1 billion. Okay, so let's say, let's say just from individuals, let's say you deposited $1,000 into your bank in a bank. So if the reserve requirement ratio, is, which we call R, is 10%. That means that by law, the required reserves by this bank must equal to little r times that deposit, which is going to be equal to, what is R is 10%. 10% is 0.1. You multiply that by $1,000. That means by law, this bank should have out of the what? $1,000, $100 should not be loaned out. This money should actually be deposited with the Fed. So if every customer who is depositing money, 10% of their monies must be kept as required reserve. That means the bank doesn't need to go by looking at millions and every customer that are depositing money in a bank, like Bank of America might have millions of customers depositing money in every 2 weeks. All the Fed needs to do is just look at the end of the 2 weeks. What is the total? If the bank was keeping 10% from every customer's deposit, and the total deposit in Bank of America was $10 billion, then the Fed is going to ensure that at the end of the 2 weeks period, Bank of America should have at least 10% of that $10 billion be deposited with the Fed as required reserves. And then whatever remains, so this case, so a customer deposited $1,000. By law, this bank should not loan $100. So the remainder from the remainder of what? $900 is what we call excess reserves. The bank is free to loan this excess reserve whatever it wishes, whether loan all of it or keep some of it, whatever it wants to do. So that means we can then break down the total reserves can be broken down. Okay, I want you to see this very well, what I'm writing here. So that means total reserves can be broken down into what we call required reserves plus excess reserves. Which for short, I can write my notation for total reserve is going to be one single R. The single R must equal to required reserves. I can write that's RR plus excess reserve. I can write it as ER. There you go. So this, I want you to remember this formula very well. So the example that I gave you, we said if a customer deposit $1,000 into their bank account, let's say with Bank of America, by law, we know that the required reserve, if the required reserve ratio is R equals to 10%, we know that the required reserve is going to be equal to that R, which is 10% multiplied by that deposit. So in this case, if D, suppose deposit, which we're denoting as D, equals to $1,000. That means the required reserve is going to be equals to 10%, because R is 10%, 0.1 multiplied by $1,000 is $100. So that means we know already, anytime a customer deposit money in the bank, the total reserves is going to go up, because total reserve is the assets of the bank. It's a double accounting entry. Deposit, when you deposit, that's what I said earlier on, very early on. I said anytime a deposit is made in the bank, it will increase bank asset reserves, total reserves, and liability deposit by the same amount. But now we are breaking down that total deposit into two component parts. So once you deposit money in the bank, we know that your reserves here has increased by $1,000 in the bank, but out of which $100 must be deposited with the Fed, because that's what we're saying, what we find here. So that means the excess reserves would be what? If you solve for ER by subtracting 100 from both sides, you get excess reserve equals to $900. Then the bank is free to do whatever it wants to do with that $900. Okay, so now here's what the bank is gonna do. So now I want us to translate. Let's do an example now with $100, because we have been doing $100 here. Okay, so now I want you to know, let's go. So suppose this is what happens in practice. Suppose Sarah deposits $100 in First National Bank, FNB. FNB stands in notation for First National Bank. I'll say if the required reserve ratio is 10%, okay, then that means from Sarah's deposit, total reserve is going to be $100. We know that. But required reserves is going to be, you take the required reserve ratio times that deposit that Sarah put in her bank. That's a formula we talk about, which is going to be 0.1 times $100. So in this case, the bank must deposit this required reserve with the Fed by law, which is going to be $10. So this bank, but we know that total reserves equals to required reserves plus excess reserves. So if this is $100, this is going to be $10, which we already found out. This is excess reserve is going to be what? $90. And we are going to assume that the banks are free to loan their excess reserve. They can invest that excess reserve either by loaning it to customers, or they could use it to invest in bonds. But let's pretend that this bank decides to lend. The bank is free to lend all its excess reserve. So it's up to the manager or the CEO of the bank what they want to do with this excess reserve. Some banks are very conservative. They're going to say, we're not going to loan all of it. We shall keep some within the bank and loan maybe $50. But if we assume that this bank loans out all these $90, because they're going to make money by loaning it out when they charge interest rate. Lending interest is high. And then on the balance sheet, what has happened? How do we represent this on the balance sheet? What has happened? So I want to go step by step so that you understand. So at the very beginning, let's say this is a T account. So Sarah, on the right-hand side, we record what? Liabilities. And then this is assets on the left-hand side. So this is First National Bank balance sheet. So we're saying that when Sarah deposit $100, so deposit is going to be $100. And then a balance sheet is a double accounting entry. So reserve, that means bank already has Sarah's money at hand, which is part of his reserve, equals to $100. And then we have just found, then eventually, this balance sheet is going to turn like this. We know that total reserves can be broken down as required reserves and excess reserves. So that means the right hand side is going to be still the same. Deposit, Sarah still knows our deposit is there, $100. But now this reserve is broken down into required reserves. We talked about that. The RR, which is going to be now $10, which we calculate that because it's 10% of the total deposit. And then excess reserves, which is now what? $90. So the balance sheet still balancing. So $100 here, $100 here. Okay. But we're saying that banks are free to loan all these $90. So suppose First National Bank decide to loan all those $90 excess reserves. What would the balance sheet look like? This is what, just hold on a second. And this guy's going to look like. The balance sheet of First National Bank then will look like this. We still have liabilities on the right. We still have assets on the left as usual. So the deposit at this bank is still $100. But now we know required reserves is $10. Then the excess reserve, the bank has now turned that into loans. They're going to loan, which is what? $90. So this is how the balance sheet is going to look like. I'm saying plus $100 because there were other reserves in the deposit in the bank before this transaction happened. So that's exactly what we're doing here. See, when $100 in, so we are breaking it down because it was a $100 deposit, which was what? First balance sheet was this balance sheet up here, which we now broke it down into required reserve and excess reserve. And that's what you're seeing on the PowerPoint slide here. This is required reserve because 10% of every deposit must be kept as required reserves. So that's $10, and then whatever remains is excess reserve of $90. So the banks are free to loan these $90. That's why the balance sheet is going to transform itself like this. The required reserve is $10. The bank has transformed excess reserve into loans, $90. So the balance sheet is going to balance. So that leads us to what we call the asset transformation. So that's how we do balance sheet entries. So asset transformation is basically selling liabilities with one set of characteristics and using the proceeds to buy assets with a different set of characteristics. So in other words, the bank borrows short and lends long. What do we mean by that? When you deposit money into your bank, it is as if the bank is borrowing money from you. I don't know whether you ever thought about that, because that is your money. But the bank is going to use your money and lend it to other individuals. That's what we call asset transformation. The bank borrows short from you, but lends long. That's right. Okay. So up to this point, but you know how to do your balance sheet. Now, we have understood, I believe, how to do balance sheet entries when you deposit money in the bank, what happens to reserves and what happens to deposit. And that reserve is going to be broken down into excess reserve and required reserves. Required reserve ratio is always given you. That's what is needed to figure out what the reserve requirement is. The reserve requirement, you're going to take that required reserve ratio, the little r, which is always like 10, 20% or 5%. You multiply that fraction, which is in percentage, times the total time the deposit to figure out what your total reserve requirement is. And then you're going to subtract the reserve requirement from the total reserves to get what the excess reserve is. That excess reserve is what the bank is going to loan out. But required reserve has to be deposited with the Fed. So this is coming from just one customer's deposit. Who deposit $100. Some customers, like corporations, are depositing maybe $1 million or $1 billion. So somebody deposited another person will deposit, we're going to record another check about deposit of $1 billion. Then by law, 10% of $1 billion, which is going to be $100,000, has to be kept in required reserves. That means $900,000. the bank can loan out from that single deposit of $1 billion. So this repeats itself for all deposits in the banking system. Okay, so now let's go and start discussing the general principles of bank management. Okay, what do chief executives do on a day-to-day basis to be able to profit maximize? Okay, is what I want to discuss next. Okay, so here they're going to be the 6 most important components. What you do, because a lot of you are going to, and I want to show you, there's a lady who took my class about 4 years ago here at Texas State. She's now the vice president of a bank in Houston. So she's one part of the executive. And she calls me, she sends me email and tells me that what I showed them in the class, like these general principles of bank management, is what she deploys on a day-to-day basis to manage that bank. So don't shoot yourself for short, don't undersell yourself. Maybe one of you or some of you are going to be that lady who's now the VP of a bank in Houston, or even a much bigger bank, one of the bigger banks in the nation. Okay, so here are the general principles of bank management. We're going to be going through liquidity management. We're going to talk about asset management. We're going to talk about liability management. What does that mean? We shall talk about capital adequacy management. Then we shall talk about if you're the chief executive, how do you manage credit risk? How do you manage interest rate risk? So those are going to be the 6 key component elements. What we call them the general principles of bank management. Things that the CEO wakes up every morning and they're going to be staring at the balance sheet and see, what can we do on the balance sheet? Do we have enough liquid assets? Do we have enough long-term assets? What is our liability? How much have we borrowed? Those kind of stuff. But it requires knowledge of the balance sheet entries that we just talked about. Okay, so let's start with the first, the liquidity management. Okay, so I want you to pay much attention here. So here, we are going to assume that the bank is faced with a required reserve ratio of 10%. This is set by the regulatory body, the Federal Reserve, that every commercial bank, a fraction of customers' deposit, 10%, must not be loaned out or invested by the bank. That money has to be kept with the bank as required reserves. Okay, so let's assume that. Let's begin with the balance sheet scenario on the left. There are 2 balance sheets I gave you here. So let's say this bank has a total deposit of $100 million, because deposits are bank liability, and then it also has a bank capital of $10 million. And then on the left-hand side, this bank has a total reserve of $20 million. And its loan portfolio is $80 million. And he has invested in securities like bonds, like treasury bonds, or state and local government bonds, what we call municipal bonds, which is equal to $10 million. So if the required, okay, so remember, this is total reserves. Okay, I'm dealing with only the balance sheet on the left at this moment. So that means we know that total reserves, you write this formula up here, equals to required reserves. We just talked about this, plus excess reserves. Okay, so we have been given this guy to be equals to 20 million. You see it on this balance sheet. That's the total reserves. And we know the required reserve ratio, this is your little r, is 10%. So we know that the reserve ratio, or the minimum reserve requirement, sorry, the reserve requirement, minimum reserve requirement, the Fed, you take the reserve ratio times the deposit, which is going to be equal to 10% is 0.1. Multiplied by deposit is 100 million here, multiplied by 100 million. So by law, the Federal Reserve requires that this bank, out of this $100 million, they should have at least $10 million, because 0.1 times 100 million is 10 million. But this bank has 20 million. This bank has more than what the Fed requires, because the Fed requires that they have $10 million, meaning that this bank has got an excess reserve of what? If you do the math here, subtract $10 million from both sides to solve for this ER. This bank has got an excess reserve of $10 million. Bank is okay. Okay, now, let's say there's a deposit outflow. This bank has got some wealthy customer who comes to this bank and withdraws $10 million. There's a deposit outflow of $10 million. So now let's look at how the balance sheet of this bank is going to change. Look at the second balance sheet now. So once a withdrawal happens, somebody comes and withdraws $10 million. See, the deposit in the bank is going to be down to $90 million, because when we withdraw money from a bank, deposits go down. You know that. That's a no-brainer. The question is, how should this bank pay for that withdrawal of $10 million? Because the balance sheet must balance. It's a double accounting entry where transactions enter as a debit and as a credit. So once you withdraw $10 million from this bank, the deposits are down $10 million. Banks are going to use part of their reserves to pay for that withdrawal. So you see, the total reserves are going to be down by $10 million, from 20 million to 10 million. Okay, now let's go back again. So now this bank is faced with this new balance sheet situation. So we know that the total reserves, the formula is the same, is required reserves plus excess reserve. So now, given this new balance sheet situation, the deposit is only now 90 million. The required reserve ratio is 10%. So by law, the required reserves, or the minimum reserve requirement by the Fed, you take the required reserve ratio times the deposit. So this bank, by law, this bank now, the balance sheet scenario here, they are supposed to keep 10%, 0.1 times $90 million as required reserve, which is basically $9 million. Okay, but it turns out that this bank has a total reserves of $10 million. So if you write the formula, this bank now has $10 million in reserve after the withdrawal has happened. But the required reserve is what? The Fed only requires them to have $9 million. So if you're the CEO of this bank, nothing to worry about, because you still have an excess reserve of what? Of $1 million. You're not breaking the law. You have the requirement, because the Fed says at the minimum reserve requirement now has to be, at least you need to have $9 million in reserves. But you have 10 million. You actually have more than what the Fed requires you to keep. So you're doing good. Okay. So now, having said that, let's go to the second balance sheet scenario. So this scenario, this is a case where if you're the chief executive of this bank, you go to work every day. So one day you went to work. Yesterday you went to bed when this was your balance sheet. And then you went to work today, a customer came and withdrew $10 million. So now this is your new scenario. But in this case, you're still going to go to sleep. No, nothing to worry about, because you still have, you're keeping up with what the Federal Reserve wants you to do. By regulation, you need $9 million. Okay? But you have more than 9. You have 10 million. You actually have an excess reserve of $1 million. Okay, but let's go to the second balance sheet scenario. Okay, on the second slide. Okay, so now let's assume that here's your scenario. So in this case, if I write my equation, the total reserves in the banking system equals to required reserves plus excess reserves. So this bank is has $10 million in reserves, total reserves. The bank is still faced with a required reserve ratio of 10%. So the little r is 10%. By law, the Fed wants that every deposit made in the bank, 10% must be kept as required reserves. So all the total deposit in the bank, 10% must be kept as what? Required reserves. So what is required reserves here? The RR, based on this balance sheet on the left. You're going to take the required reserve ratio of 10%, which is 0.1, times the deposit, which is going to be the same thing as 0.1 times the deposit is what? 100 million. So that is $10 million. So this bank has got a required reserve of $10 million. Now, this is different from what I showed you in the previous slides. Now, the excess reserve in this case is 0. This bank has no excess reserves at all. Because if you solve for excess reserve here by subtracting $10 million from both sides, you get an excess reserve of 0. Okay, now, let's assume that a customer walks into this bank and withdraws $10 million. So that this is going to be the new balance sheet scenario after. So you're the CEO of the bank. You went to bed last night with this balance sheet scenario. And then you came back this morning and somebody walks into your bank and withdraws $10 million. And when they withdraw $10 million, now, okay, now you can see the deposit in this bank is down $10 million, now down to $90 million. How do we pay for withdrawal again when a customer, for deposit outflows, when a customer walks into a bank and withdraws net $10 million, then we use reserves. The bank had a reserve for $10 million. So what you're going to use that reserve to pay for that deposit outflow, that withdrawal. So your reserve is going to be down to zero. Now, this is an interesting scenario now. But by law, remember, now you're faced with this scenario. We know the formula says total reserve equals to required reserves plus excess reserves. So under this case, this bank has got a what? Now has a total reserves of what? Of zero. But by law, the required reserve has to be $9 million. This bank needs to have at least $9 million here. Okay? So now the question is, what do you do as a chief executive? This is what we're going to be calling liquidity management. What do you do? Because the Federal Reserve regulates all banks in the United States every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks, they want to ensure that all banks are keeping up with that minimum reserve requirement. So let's say this happened within the first week, and you're freaking out as a chief executive of this bank, of this First National Bank. You know the Fed is going to come after you next week. They want to make sure that you at least have $9 million as required reserves, minimum reserve on your balance sheet. But right now you have zero. Now, so one of the things that we have learned so far, what's the importance of excess reserves? So excess reserves are going to guard against, it's an insurance against deposit outflows, against withdrawal. Okay, banks must keep enough excess reserves, liquidity, so that when a customer walks into that bank, they have money to pay for and still keep the minimum reserve requirement that the Fed wants them to keep. So the key benefit of keeping excess reserve is that they act as an insurance against deposit outflow or withdrawal. Okay, so now the Fed wants this in 2 weeks. They want you to have at least this $9 million. So what the question is, since you lack $9 million in minimum reserve requirement, what are going to be your course of action? What do you do as a CEO to come up with the $9 million here? So let's go and discuss. And they have to go, I'm going to discuss them in the order of importance. I'm going to tell you why. Let's go to the second slide. So the first thing that you're going to do as a CEO, the most possible solution to this, you are going to go to other banks and try to borrow money. That's right. So if this is First National Bank or this is Bank of America or First National Bank, you're going to go to like Citibank and try to borrow $9 million. Because you're freaking out. The Fed wants that. The Fed doesn't care wherever you get that money. They just need to have that $9 million deposit with the Fed. Okay? So the first course of action that you're going to do is, so the first one is, what I'm describing here is also the actions you undertake to restore $9 million reserve, minimum reserve requirement. So the first course of action is you're going to borrow from other banks. Try to borrow from other banks. Okay, so here, while you're faced with a zero reserve and the Fed wants $9 million, some banks out there, maybe Wells Fargo, maybe Capital One, okay, maybe Citibank, okay, or maybe the Texas Bank or whatever bank out there is left out there, or JP Morgan Chase. They may be having plenty of excess reserve that they want to loan out because banks loan money among each other. So the first course of action is that this bank is going to go to another bank and try to borrow what? $9 million. So if this bank is successful for borrowing $9 million, they're going to borrow $9 million and stick it there. And now your new balance sheet scenario, after you successfully borrow $9 million, see, you're going to borrow and stick $9 million. But remember, balance sheet is a double accounting entry. Because you borrow money, that's going to be a new liability item on the balance sheet, on the liability side of the balance sheet. Borrowing $9 million. It's a double accounting entry. Okay? So you have $9 million, which you stick there. You're sticking it there so that when the Fed comes in 2 weeks, you tell the Fed, oh, yeah, we have the minimum reserve because the minimum requirement, what, 10% of 90 million is 9 million. The Fed doesn't care where you borrow the money from, whether it was borrowing or you had kept that by, they just want to make sure that that $9 million reserve is there. But remember, there's no free lunch. Every action you're going to undertake to restore a reserve on the balance sheet costs you money. So when you borrow money from other banks, like let's say this is First National Bank borrowing from Citibank, or from Wells Fargo, or from JP Morgan Chase, or from Capital One, you're going to pay an interest rate. The banks are not going to give you money, $9 million for free. This could be short-term borrowing, overnight borrowing for 2 weeks or for a month. So if it's overnight borrowing, this bank is going to charge you an interest rate. The interest rate paid on what? You must pay on borrowed funds. That's the cost of restoring what? This $9 million. And if this borrowing is happening from another bank, this interest rate in the United States is a special name for it. We call that interest rate the federal funds rate. So the federal funds rate is the interest rate that banks charge each other for overnight lending of reserves. Okay? In other countries, they call it the interbank rate. That's why actually in general we call it you go to the People's Bank of China, or you go to to China, and banks in China borrow money, or in Africa, or in Europe, anywhere. They just call it interbank rate because that's the interest rate that banks charge each other when they lend each other funds. In the United States, we just call it the federal funds rate. So the federal funds rate is the same thing as interbank rate. Okay, so that's option number one. But let's say, let me open a new slide here to explain what's going to go on here. Let's say you went to this was First National Bank trying to borrow from other banks to restore reserves, and it went to Bank of America. Bank of America said, no, we don't have that money either. We're also in liquidity crisis. You go to JP Morgan Chase. JP Morgan Chase says the same thing. We don't have money. You go to like Capital One. Capital One says the same thing. So you go, well, everybody turns you down. Okay, everybody's turning you down. You're freaking out. The Fed needs $9 million, but you can't find those funds anywhere. Then the second course of action, so we're still discussing the course of action you're going to take. So the second course of action, if you cannot find a loan anywhere from other banks, I know none of the other banks want to lend you funds, then what you're going to do, the second less whatever costly action, they must be in that order. Okay, you are going to try to sell securities. Sell some of your treasury securities to get the $9 million. So let's go back to your balance sheet when your reserve was down to zero. So here you case where you try to borrow money from other banks because you want $9 million there, but you couldn't find any money available. All other banks are saying, no, we don't have, we're also in liquidity problems. We don't have that. We don't have that. Or maybe you're outrightly rejected, Your bank is not being loaned money from other banks. So the next possible alternative, you're going to sell some of your securities. Because right now you have $10 million of treasury bonds that you have invested in. Okay? Treasury securities or municipal bonds. So you're going to dispose some of these municipal bond investments. You're going to sell because you need $9 million. So you're going to sell $9 million of $10 million security, and then you stick that money here. So if you decide to sell your securities and you successfully do so, here's going to be how your balance sheet is going to change. Remember, Nice. You are $10 million here. So you sold $9 million worth out of that 10 million to raise the 9 million that the Fed wants you to have here. Then you stick that money again. That's an easy, it sounds easy. But remember, the cost of selling securities in the securities market, there are transaction costs. You have to go, there are brokerage fees, you have to pay brokers that help you sell those securities. And other transaction costs. One of the costs that you're going to incur, remember, you earn interest payments from your security investment. You are earning interest payments on $10 million bond investment. But if you sold $9 million out of those $10 million investments in bonds, that means you're going to forego the interest rate that you should have earned had you not sold those securities, had you kept them on the balance sheet. So those are all the transaction costs that we're talking about here. So remember, I told you every action you take, there's a cost associated with it. Okay? There's a cost associated with every undertaking, because you need that $9 million. But this is a second, least the second least stringent course of action that will not cost you a lot of money. Okay, but sometimes you try to sell your securities. Sometimes maybe the securities you're holding on the balance sheet takes a long time for them to be disposed of. The Fed is coming after you in a week and a half. You cannot sell those securities within the shortest amount of time because it takes time for money to clear here and there, even when you sold securities. And you fear that if you're holding a bunch of illiquid securities that which are less liquid, that means they're not very easy to sell in the shortest amount of time. That means selling securities wouldn't be an option. Okay. So if selling securities is not an option, then the third possible option that you're available with, remember I said at the beginning that banks can borrow from other banks or they can borrow from the Federal Reserve. Remember borrowing, we discussed the first option already. Borrow from what? You try to borrow from other banks. That's the first from other banks. That was not an option. Then you sell your securities. Somebody may ask me, if a bank fails to borrow from other banks, why couldn't they go? Because they can borrow from the Federal Reserve as well. The reason why you don't want to go to the Fed immediately or too soon is because, remember, the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, is also your regulator. They're the ones regulating you. So if you keep knocking on the doors of the Federal Reserve wanting to borrow money, anytime you're in liquidity crisis like this, it's like you're sending a red signal that something's wrong with you, is going on with your bank. That is, in other words, you're actually trying to invite regulators to come and shut you down. So as a chief executive of a bank, you keep that option late in the game. That's why the second option, you will try to sell securities. But now, if you try to sell securities and that's not an option, then the third option would be true. You're going to borrow from the Fed. Try to borrow from the Fed. Remember, borrow from the Fed. And soon, when I start talking about central banking and the Federal Reserve System in about a week, you're going to soon learn that borrowing from a Federal Reserve, from a central bank, is borrowing as a last resort. That's actually one of the main reasons where a central bank is created in the first place. The central bank plays a major or a critical role as a lender of the last resort. That if banks in a country are faced with liquidity crisis, the Federal Reserve or the central bank ensures first that those banks try to borrow money among each other. If they cannot find loans available among each other, then the last place they go to is the Federal Reserve. So any central bank, even the Federal Reserve, that begins to lend funds to banks before banks have even tried to borrow from among each other, loses its critical role as a lender of the last resort. Okay, I want to make that very clear. So now, if you borrow from a Fed, borrowing from a Fed is not free either. The Fed is going to charge you the interest rate that the Fed charges you is what we call the discount rate. The discount rate is the interest rate that the Fed is going to charge banks for overnight lending of reserves to banks or loans to banks. So now, if borrowing from a Federal Reserve is borrowing as a lender of the last resort, that banks go to the Fed after they've tried borrowing among each other. That means the implication is that the discount rate that the Federal Reserve charges banks when the banks borrow from the Fed has to be higher than the what? The federal funds rate. By design, that is true. Because if borrowing from a Fed is a borrowing as a last resort, why would the Fed charge banks a lower interest rate that they would what? They would be charged if they borrow from each other. The Fed would not do that. In fact, if you go, I'm gonna task you. You go to the website I showed you, the Federal Reserve database, and Google out the data on the discount rate. Download data on the discount rate, and download data on the federal funds rate. You're gonna see that at every point, the discount rate has always been above the federal funds rate, and that's the way it is, because the Federal Reserve plays a critical role as a lender of the last resort. So that means the interest rate it charges bank must be above the interest rate that banks charge each other when they borrow from each other. Okay, so now to cut the story short, suppose you successfully borrow from a Fed. That's option number 3. So each of those actions are represented in this balance sheet. Okay, so this was yeah. So there you go. So you decide to borrow from a Fed. So you're going to create a new liability item because borrowing is a liability. But once the Fed gives you $9 million, then you're going to stick that money there. It's kind of ironic that the Fed wants you to have $9 million, but sometimes you're going to borrow $9 million from the Federal Reserve anyway, and you stick it there. But also, I want to be very clear, and I told you guys the interest rate that the Federal Reserve charges a discount rate. But I have to be very clear here, though. Not every bank that applies for discount loans or loan from the Federal Reserve gets one. Okay? The banks also have credit ratings, just like we ordinary Americans, that if you go and apply for a loan, your bank might deny you a loan. Okay, the Fed could deny banks loan, but but if they successfully borrow from the Fed, yes, then that's how we're gonna enter that on the balance sheet. So the cost here is the discount rate. Okay. Okay, so now suppose some CEOs, if they know that their bank has been in, maybe they have not been following the law so much, the Fed has been warning them in the past. Sometimes they may skip this step. They may avoid completely going to the Fed because they don't want to be knocking on the door of the Fed. Or there are some banks that might actually try to borrow from the Fed, as I say, then the Fed could deny them the loans. But the Fed is coming after them in about a week and a half because they want them to have that $9 million there. So if either way, if you are the CEO who doesn't want to pass through the Fed to borrow money, yeah, you're trying to avoid, because that sends a red signal that your bank, something's wrong with your bank. Or you are CEO, you try to borrow and the Fed said no anyway. Then the last option you're going to do, this is going to be the most costly option. Okay. The last option, I ran out of room there, so let me open a new slide here. So if you try to borrow from a Fed and the Fed said no, then now you're left with the last possible option, option number 4, which is option number 4 is going to be you're going to sell loans. And or call in loans. What do we mean by the two? I'm going to explain. This is the most costly option. Okay, so let's go back to the balance sheet to see what I'm talking about here. So you are faced with a zero reserve here, and you need $9 million. So now we are saying that if you cannot borrow from other banks, you cannot sell securities, you cannot borrow from a Federal Reserve, then the last possible, the worst case scenario is for you to sell some of your loan portfolio. Where are your loans here? Right here. Right now, you have a $90 million loan portfolio on your balance sheet as a bank. And you guys are going to encounter this. Have you guys ever found come into a scenario where, let's say you had a car payment, you had a car loan, and you bought a car and you took a $40,000 loan from a bank, and the bank says your monthly payment is $500. So every month you send the $500 to make payments on your car. And then all of a sudden, the bank, you go to your mailbox and you find a letter in the the bank has written to you and say, hey, from next month, we're no longer your bank. You send payments to another bank. So what does that mean? It means that bank has sold your loan to another bank. So think about that. If you have been with this bank, this is the only bank you knew in the last 10, 15 years. And you found, even though the terms of the loans are not going to change, you're still going to continue making $500 payment, but you're now going to be making that payment to a different bank. So you're going to be really upset. You're going to ask a lot of questions that, oh, I've been with this bank for 10, 15 years, and then they just decided to sell my loans with some other banks that I've never dealt with. That sounds a little traumatizing and a little bit kind of like, you feel like you've been snapped. Okay. So, and most banks are trying to avoid this because it makes them lose their loyal customer base. So that in the future, customers may not want to go back to that bank. That's why this is the most costly option, selling loans. So if you sell in loans, to these banks they're gonna sell $9 million of the $90 million loan to another bank. That means its loan portfolio is gonna be down to $81 million because they sold $9 million of this loan portfolio and stuck the money there. So we're gonna have this. The balance sheet is gonna look like this. Okay. So you see, remember the loan portfolio was $90 million. If you sell it, you're down to 81. Then you've got $9 million sticky there. When the Fed comes by, we got the money, right? The other thing, if you're not outrightly selling loans, there's also what we call calling in loans. This is actually so bad. But sometimes, some customers will cut the bank a slack. Let's say I have a company and I have a line of credit with my bank. So the bank always give me money, and I pay back. So let's say I went and maybe I'd borrowed like about $20 million out of the $90 million loan. So instead of the bank selling loan, if the CEO of I'm the CEO of my company, if I'm in a good relation with the bank CEO, where I normally borrow money, let's say I took the money yesterday, the loan, the CEO of that bank might call me and say, wait, man, we're in liquidity crisis here. Can you cut us some slack? Can you bring back the $9 million that we approved you yesterday? So some people may not like that, even though me and the CEO to CEO, we're in good relationship. You gave me the approval loan, you're calling it back. That's what we call calling in loans, where CEOs can call back loans, say, okay, we gave you the money, yes, and you can say no. But if you're in a good relation with this bank, sometimes you can cut them some slack and say, okay, I'll give you back part of the loan you gave me yesterday. But remember, that's going to antagonize customers. Whether selling loans or calling loans is not good for the bank. And then the other thing, the most costly thing that is going to happen when a bank decides to sell its loan to another bank, the bank that is buying this loan knows that the bank that is selling loan might be in serious liquidity problem. They are going to have chips on their shoulder. They're going to say, okay, we are going to buy those loans, but only at discounts. Because maybe the customers that the loan portfolio is comprised of about maybe has a lot of credit risk in it. Maybe the customer that may not pay this loan back. So we can only buy it at a substantial discount. That's why. So this is going to be one of the most costly. But there's the last option anyway. So those are the four. That's what we call liquidity management. Those are the four actions that you undertake to kind of restore liquidity on the balance sheet. Suppose you're running out of the required reserves, and the Federal Reserve is coming after you because of regulatory requirements. So the first option I talked about, you're going to borrow from other banks. If that's not a possibility, remember, every undertaking costs you money. If you borrow from other banks, the cost is going to be the federal funds rate, which is the interest rate that the other bank is going to charge you for overnight lending of those reserves. If that's not a case, then the second option is going to be you're going to be selling in what? Securities. You sell some of your treasury bonds or municipal bonds that you have on your balance sheet. But the cost of disposing your securities are going to be, you're going to incur some huge transaction costs, including the opportunity cost of what? Of selling those securities, which would be the foregone interest rate that you should have earned had you left those securities on your what? On your balance sheet. But as I said, selling securities sometimes is not an option either because some bonds might be less liquid. It takes time before you can liquidate them. That's not an option. Then the third option was borrowing from the Fed, and the Fed is going to charge you even a much higher interest rate, which is called the discount rate, because the Federal Reserve acts as a lender of the last resort. But if the Fed denies you a loan, or maybe some CEOs want to bypass the Fed because they don't want to send a red signal, then the last option that's available to you is basically what I just talked about, either selling loans or calling in loans. Okay, but this is the last and the worst possible option available to you as a chief executive. Okay, so that is liquidity management. That's what you do. So remember, that's only one thing that a CEO does on a day-to-day basis. So let's go to the second thing, which is what? Asset management. How do you manage assets on the balance sheet? So there are three goals of asset management on a balance sheet of a bank. One, you want to seek the highest possible returns on loans and securities. And you should be able to reduce risk. Good luck with that. Good luck with that. Those two. Okay, when I say that you're going to be seeking the highest possible returns on loans and securities, what does that mean? That means as a bank, you're probably going to be giving out loans to customers and charging high interest rates. Okay? So the question is, who are those Americans who will pay high interest rate on the loans you give them? They're going to be those Americans with very low credit ratings. That means they're credit risk already. So if you can pull it off, that you're going to charge high interest rate because you want to have high return on the loan portfolio and be able to minimize risk, good luck. I mean, those two are kind of in conflict to each other. You can pull, some CEOs are going to have you, sometimes depends, you may have the right mix of your loan portfolio, loan some money to Americans with in good credit standing. Also some portfolio go to some relatively risky, if they can pay you back, you make a lot of money. Or you could also be investing in bonds that are highly risky, like maybe municipal bonds. Municipal bonds sometimes have some risk. Treasury bonds don't have any risk because the United States, much as we have the biggest debt in the world, government debt, the US government has never defaulted in the history of the nation's founding. So that makes the treasury bond the safest bet. Okay? So you could, but if you want to seek the highest, so if you're investing only in treasury bond, remember the interest rate on treasury bonds are very low, because the lower the risk, the lower the return. You know that. So that means if you want to seek the highest return on your treasury bond, also on your securities portfolio, you need to be mixing up your bond portfolio. Not only do you have a lot of treasury bond, you need to be going to some municipal bonds, which might have some risk. Because while the federal government has never defaulted, local governments have defaulted in the United States. In 2008, during the financial crisis, the city of Detroit, Michigan, defaulted on its debt. Orange County, California, which is one of the richest counties in the nation, defaulted on its debt a couple of years ago. Okay, the city of Stockton, California, defaulted in 2009 in the height of the financial crisis. So while the federal government has never defaulted, state and local level governments have risk, because we have witnessed city governments and county governments defaulted in the past. Okay, so just remember that. Okay, but if you can pull it, then of course you're going to reduce risk. But the one thing that has no brainer in your asset portfolio is just, as a CEO, don't screw up. Don't invest all the money, possible money that the bank has in long-term assets. Make sure you have adequate liquidity, that when customers come, let's say they want to withdraw money from the bank, you have adequate liquidity. You can pay that out, without a blink of an eye, because you're maintaining a lot of liquid assets within your bank. If a wealthy customer like Warren Buffett shows up in your bank and says he wants to withdraw $1 billion or $1 million, you're not going to be telling Warren Buffett that, hey, we don't have it today. That's not a good customer, maintaining a good customer relationship out there. Okay, so here are the 4 tools to achieve the 3 goals of asset management. The first goal is that, as I already talked about this, for you to be able to attain the goal of seeking the highest possible returns on loans and securities, that means you're going to find borrowers who will pay high interest rates and have the low possibility of defaulting. As I said, good luck with that. Or you're going to purchase security with high returns and low risk. Good luck with that too. But the one thing that we gotta know that one of the critical tools, which we all agree with, that is not, there's no controversy on that, is we can lower risk by diversification. As my mama always told me, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Diversification basically means a bank should be able to invest its assets, invest money in different asset portfolio. So you don't only give, for example, only mortgage loans. You make sure you diversify your loan portfolio. You're giving mortgage loans, you're giving car loans, you're giving commercial loans or industrial loans, you're giving consumer loans like credit cards and others. Diversify your loan portfolio, then diversify your other asset portfolio like your securities. Okay, that's what we call spreading your risk. You spread away the risk through diversification. And so then balance the need for liquidity against increased returns for less liquid assets. So you have to have the right mix of your highly liquid assets, or what they call current assets, versus long-term assets or fixed assets. Because you don't want to dump all the investment in fixed assets. You need to have some adequate liquidity, for your immediate needs, like caring for customers' withdrawals, customers who are coming to withdraw money from a bank. You need to have ready money to pay out. So you need to have adequate liquidity. Okay, so that's a balancing the need for liquidity against increased returns from less liquid assets or long-term assets. Okay, so those are just that is asset management. It's not a lot, but if you in actual practice, it's a lot. If you're doing that, you're doing a lot of balancing things here as a CEO on your balance sheet. And then the third thing that chief executives do is liability management. Okay, and again, you just like any American or any company, there are banks, because banks, I've told you already, banks borrow money. They can borrow from a Federal Reserve, they can borrow from other banks. They can also borrow from a commercial paper by issuing commercial paper. We'll talk about that, what commercial papers are. They're like bond-like instruments. They're also rated, where you put some collateral and you borrow, say, $1 billion in a commercial paper, and corporations can lend you money as well. And then you pay back that loan maybe in 2 weeks or in a month or in 6 months. Okay? But the one simple thing that we should agree on, anytime you are borrowing money, even as an individual like you and me, or as a bank, or as a corporation, you're trying to seek for the lowest possible interest rate. Okay, so as a bank CEO, you want to look for, anytime you must borrow, you need to shop around and find the best loan that you can get out there with the lowest interest. We can agree that. But one thing that when you go through the history of the U.S. banking, some 60 years ago, because when you draw the bank balance sheet, remember checkable deposit is a liability. It goes on the right-hand side. Checkable deposit. More money in checking accounts is a liability. So about 60 years ago, checkable deposit used to account for about 60% of the total liabilities of banks in America. So banks in America heavily relied on checkable deposit, that Americans deposit money on their checking account, then the banks would use the checking account deposit to transform them into what? Bank assets like loans and other things, portfolios. But over time, in contemporary times, checkable deposit and now account for less than 10% of the total liabilities of banks. Why? Because of the innovation that has happened in the financial industry. Okay, like the development of commercial paper, or overnight loan markets and new financial instruments like commercial paper and negotiable certificate of deposit. We're going to talk about some of these instruments as we proceed. So banks find there are so many ways that banks can borrow funds that they've reduced their reliance on what? On checkable deposit as a source of liability, like the development of the commercial paper money market, overnight loan markets, which used to exist in 60 years ago, where banks can borrow money from any sources by issuing commercial paper or just overnight borrowing from other corporations or other banks. Okay, so the recent phenomenon, the rise of money center banks, so different sources of borrow. That's all I'm saying. Okay, that's liquidity management, just briefly. But the most important thing you want to do as a bank, anytime you must borrow, seek for the lowest possible interest rate. Don't just go to one source and say, oh, we are willing to lend you money, but at 8%. You could get a loan somewhere, maybe at 3%. Why don't you shop around? Okay. Then the next thing, so we're making progress here. What else can a CEO do? Perform on the balance sheet. Principles of bank management here. So we're done with what? We're done with liquidity management. We're done with asset management. We're done with liability management. Now let's talk about capital adequacy management. So here we're going to be doing some what we call ratio analysis, okay, on the balance sheet. So the capital adequacy management, one of the things that you got to know that as a chief executive of the bank, I need to work with the owners of the bank and the shareholders or the stockholders of the bank, that a bank, for a bank to run smoothly, it has to have adequate capital. The history teaches us that American banks which have got inadequate liquidity are the ones who typically go bankrupt or become insolvent if the economy goes in a bad state. They will go in a recession. The banks that have inadequate capital are the ones who get shut down first. So having adequate capital means that your bank is going to be safe. It's not going to get closed down. But so bank capital helps to prevent bank failure. Okay. But we're going to talk about the amount of capital also affects the return of owners. We're going to talk about that, what they call the return on equity for equity holders, for like stockholders of the bank. But some of the capital adequacy management comes as a result of the regulatory requirement from the Fed. Because the Federal Reserve, is going to set some minimum capital requirements for all banks in America. And these minimum capital requirements depends on the size of the bank. For credit unions, like small banks like credit unions, savings and loans associations, these are banks maybe with very small, they have very small operations. The capital requirement is going to be small. So the Federal Reserve might say that if you're operating a credit union, at every time, maybe the minimum capital you should have at all times for you to stay in operation, not to be shut down by the Fed, could be $20 million. But that might differ depending on the size of the bank. What about the too big to fail? Like the large commercial banks in America, like like Citibank, Wells Fargo, Capital One, the JP Morgan Chase. Those banks have relatively larger capital requirements. Maybe the Federal Reserve might say, for you to operate a too big to fail, maybe the minimum capital threshold could be $1 trillion. Or maybe $200 billion, or whatever it is. Okay, so some of the capital adequacy management comes as a result of the regulatory requirement. But as a bank, I tell you what, if you ever operate a bank, let's say you're operating a small bank, even a community bank like our saving and loans associations, or you're operating a credit union, for instance, you want to have even capital beyond what the Fed requires you to have. If the Fed requires you to keep like $20 million at all time as minimum capital requirement, I would have about 40, double that, or even $50 million, just for safety, because you just never know what might happen. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna stop here for now. But when we come back, when I'm gonna record the next lecture, I'm gonna show you some of the ratio analysis that we do on the balance sheet. Okay, we're gonna talk about 3 main items there. We're gonna talk about the return on assets, the return on equity, and what we call equity multiplier. Okay. And then after we're done with those ratio analysis, then we're going to start talking about credit risk management and interest risk management, where we're going to be talking about those gap analysis and duration analysis, things that are required that the CEO needs to have for the bank to stay profitable. So I'll stop here for now, and we'll pick up from there next time. I'll see you guys next time on via Zoom again. Thank you so much. Have a good day, and make sure you're watching these videos, because at the end of the day, I have a YouTube channel. So every time I record these lectures on Zoom, because I can't do it on a Zoom cloud, because of course I record it on a Zoom cloud, but I can't leave it there, because after a week, the Zoom cloud, the lecture, the recordings automatically delete themselves. So what I do, I typically, after recording this lecture, I'm going to transfer the video recordings onto my Zoom, my YouTube. So I always send you the links. My YouTube links are permanent links. you can watch that video. It won't delay at all. Okay. So make sure you're watching the videos, because if you don't watch these lecture recordings and you're gonna go doing, you cannot do your homework without understanding the material. And the way I engage you on the screen, on the computer screen, is similar to what, and I keep saying this over and over. I mean, when I'm teaching on the computer screen like this, facing you on Zoom, it's no different from when you're in the classroom, when I'm engaging you on the board or when we were doing some computer assignments. It's the same thing. Okay. So make sure that, you watch this video, and understand the material, take notes just like you would be in a class, a regular classroom, in-person classroom. And then you go and do your assignments. So when you come to the exam, you know what to do. Okay. Oh, no, next time. Bye-bye for now.